The war was supposed to be over. At least that's what the radio said on the morning of May 9, 1945. Across Europe, church bells rang and soldiers cheered. But inside a battered field hospital on the outskirts of Lübeck, Germany, the war still whispered through the walls. The building had once been a school, now a maze of broken windows and blood-stained cots. The Red Cross flag above the doorway hung in tatters, flapping weakly in the spring wind. Inside, amid the fading echoes of artillery, one woman refused to leave. Her name was Margaret Ellison, a British nurse who had followed the Allied advance through France, Belgium, and finally into Germany. When orders came to evacuate and regroup with her unit, she stayed behind, not to protect soldiers, not to collect glory, but to care for the men no one wanted to touch, the captured German prisoners left behind after surrender. Some were wounded beyond recognition. Others were terrified boys who hadn't yet turned 20. To most, they were the enemy. To Margaret, they were simply human beings in pain. While the rest of her team packed trucks and burned old medical logs, she rolled up her sleeves and walked back inside the ward. The air reeked of antiseptic and smoke. She whispered a single sentence to the orderly who begged her to leave. "War doesn't choose who deserves mercy." The door shut behind her. Outside, jeeps rumbled away. Inside, the silence of war's ending was heavier than any battle. No reporters would know her name. No medals would bear her image. But over the coming days, that deserted hospital would become a place of both redemption and risk. A fragile island of compassion in a sea of revenge. Because what Margaret didn't know was that not everyone in the camp had surrendered, and her decision to stay behind would soon test the very limits of her humanity and the world's understanding of forgiveness. The last official shots of World War II in Europe had been fired. Germany had fallen. Cities smoldered in silence, and along the roads of northern Europe, a tide of weary soldiers limped toward home. For the victors, the war had ended. For the defeated, it had only just begun. In the shattered port city of Lübeck, once a proud Hanseatic hub, Allied trucks rolled through streets lined with rubble. The British Army had converted abandoned schools and factories into temporary field hospitals for captured German soldiers, the prisoners of a war they had started but no longer controlled. Nurse Margaret Ellison, 34, stood on the cracked steps of one such hospital. Her uniform, faded from years of service, clung to her like a memory she couldn't shake. Behind her, the hallways echoed with groans and whispered prayers in broken German. The war might have ended on paper, but inside these walls, death still lingered. Margaret had been in uniform since 1940. She'd treated Allied soldiers in Dunkirk, comforted civilians in bomb shelters during the Blitz, and crossed into France after D-Day to tend to the wounded. By the time her unit reached Germany in April 1945, she had seen every shade of human suffering. But nothing like this. The prisoners arriving now weren't the fanatical stormtroopers from propaganda posters. Most were just boys, farmers, students, or clerks pulled into the madness. They came in trucks marked with red crosses, escorted by guards who looked almost as tired as the prisoners themselves. Some still wore tattered Wehrmacht uniforms. Others had stripped insignias from their sleeves, ashamed or afraid of what those symbols meant. When news of Germany's surrender reached Lübeck, Margaret's unit received immediate orders to return to the main Allied base. Supplies were scarce, infections were spreading, and there was talk of riots in nearby towns. "Leave them," her commanding officer said, glancing at the rows of wounded Germans. "The medics from their side will take over soon." But Margaret couldn't move. The faces around her were pale, feverish, and lost. In that moment, she realized surrender hadn't ended their suffering. It had merely changed its uniform. That night, as her colleagues packed, she stayed behind in the ward. She walked between cots, checking bandages, changing dressings, whispering words none of her patients understood. "You're safe now," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if it was true. When dawn came, the last Allied trucks rolled out of the city. Margaret remained, the only nurse in a hospital filled with over 100 enemy prisoners. Her only companion was a young local interpreter named Anna Weber, barely 19, whose father had died in an air raid. Together they formed an unlikely alliance of mercy. Days turned into weeks. Food rations dwindled. The generator failed twice. They boiled rainwater for cleaning wounds and tore old bed sheets for bandages. Yet somehow they kept the ward alive. But outside the hospital walls, resentment simmered. German civilians, broken by years of war and humiliation, whispered about the British nurse who nurses Nazis. Allied patrols viewed her decision as strange, even dangerous. Some accused her of betrayal. Others called her a saint. And in the midst of all this, something darker began to unfold. Reports spread of SS soldiers hiding among the prisoners, pretending to be regular troops to avoid capture. One rumor said that a few were planning to escape, even if it meant killing the nurse who refused to abandon them. Margaret didn't believe it. Not at first. Compassion had guided her through every battlefield, every dying breath. But she was about to learn that even in peace, war left shadows that refused to fade. The first weeks passed in uneasy calm. Outside, the war's echoes faded. Inside, the wounded German prisoners stirred restlessly, their eyes hollow from both injury and guilt. Margaret worked without pause, a ghost in white, moving between the rows of cots like the last remnant of order in a world gone mad. Every morning began the same way. Boil water, check wounds, whisper a prayer that the generator would hold. The smell of disinfectant mingled with rot and diesel fumes. The Red Cross flag outside was now little more than gray cloth, flapping weakly in the wind. The men she tended watched her with quiet confusion. Some couldn't understand why an Allied nurse, a woman whose country had been bombed by their aircraft, would choose to save them. A few, especially the younger ones, broke down and wept when she changed their bandages. Others, though, remained distant, bitter, untrusting. Margaret noticed one man in particular, Corporal Franz Adler. He had the cold stare of someone who'd seen too much and felt too little. His uniform had been stripped of rank markings, but the others deferred to him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, the younger prisoners fell silent. Anna, the young interpreter, told her he had served with an SS Panzer division in Poland. Rumors whispered that he'd done terrible things. One evening, while Margaret cleaned a bayonet wound on his shoulder, she asked softly, "Do you regret it?" Adler's eyes flickered toward her, then away. "We were soldiers," he said. "You would not understand." "I understand pain," she replied. "And what happens when people stop seeing each other as human?" He didn't answer. But that night, someone carved a message into the wooden bedpost near his cot. A single word in English. Traitor. Anna found it first. "They mean you," she said nervously. Margaret brushed it off. "I've been called worse." Yet unease crept in. The tension inside the ward grew heavier with each passing day. Some prisoners avoided Adler entirely, while others seemed to take quiet orders from him. Food rations went missing. Tools vanished, and one morning Margaret woke to find a bloody bandage tied to the door handle. A silent warning. Still, she stayed. When an Allied patrol stopped by to deliver medical supplies, the officer looked at her as though she were insane. "You realize these men might kill you, Nurse Ellison?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'll take my chances. The war's taken enough souls." That night rain hammered the windows. The roof leaked over the western ward, and Margaret spent hours moving patients to dry ground. Exhaustion blurred her senses. Around midnight, she noticed Adler was missing from his bed. She found him near the supply room, his hands trembling as he tried to light a lantern. For a moment, she thought he might attack. Instead, he said quietly, "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," she answered. "There are men here who would rather die than be prisoners," he said. "They think you are here to humiliate them." "And what do you think?" He hesitated. "I think you are too brave, or too foolish." The next day, one of the guards on duty was found dead behind the courtyard wall. His throat cut, his weapon missing. The Allied command ordered all remaining prisoners to be transferred. But with communication lines down and transport delayed, Margaret and Anna were left in limbo, surrounded by men whose loyalties were unclear. Fear spread like fever. The younger prisoners huddled together, whispering about escape. The wounded grew restless, demanding more food, more morphine, more answers. Anna begged Margaret to leave. "They're not your responsibility anymore," she cried. But Margaret only shook her head. "If I go now, what was the point of everything before?" That night, the power failed completely. The hospital fell into darkness. Outside, lightning flashed across the ruined city, illuminating the courtyard where shadows moved in silence. Inside, Margaret clutched a candle, its flame shaking in her hand. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked. Boots scuffed against tile. Then came the sound, low, deliberate, of someone cocking a rifle. She turned slowly. In the flicker of light, she saw Adler standing there, weapon in hand, rainwater dripping from his hair. "Put it down," she whispered. He didn't. "They're going to execute us when the trucks come." "You know it." "They call it repatriation. But we've heard what happens." "Then face it," she said. "Don't drag more death into this room." His jaw tightened. "You think mercy will save you?" "No," she said softly. "But it might save what's left of you." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, somewhere outside, an Allied siren wailed, a signal that reinforcements were approaching. Adler's eyes flicked toward the window. In that instant, Margaret stepped forward, pushing the rifle aside. The candle fell, the flame snuffed out, and the two figures vanished into the dark. A shot rang out. The echo rolled through the empty hospital like thunder. Anna screamed from the hall, and the sound of boots and shouts filled the air. By dawn, the shooting had stopped. When the Allied convoy finally arrived, they found a scene of quiet devastation: overturned cots, broken glass, and the stench of gunpowder. Near the center of the ward lay Margaret Ellison, pale but breathing. The rifle beside her still smoked faintly, and in the far corner, Franz Adler knelt, wounded, pressing his hand to his side. He looked up at the soldiers, his voice hoarse. "She saved us," he said, "even when we didn't deserve it." When Margaret awoke, sunlight was spilling across the cracked ceiling. Her shoulder throbbed. A bullet had grazed her near the collarbone. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. The smell of antiseptic, smoke, and blood brought it back. The war was over, but the nightmare had returned. Anna sat beside her, eyes red from crying. "They're taking them away," she whispered. "The prisoners, all of them." Through the shattered doorway, Margaret saw Allied soldiers rounding up the wounded Germans, moving them toward waiting trucks. Among them was Franz Adler, limping heavily, his hands bound. He turned once, meeting her eyes across the rubble-strewn corridor. For the first time she saw something human in his face. Not defiance, not pride, but guilt. She tried to rise. "Wait, he—" Anna pressed her back down. "He's alive because of you. You stopped him. Don't do more." But Margaret's mind was spinning. The last thing she remembered was the shot. The flash of lightning, the cold rain, and Adler's desperate eyes. She hadn't known if she'd killed him or saved him. Now, as the convoy pulled away, she felt both relief and grief intertwine. For the next 2 days, Allied medics occupied the hospital. They treated her wounds and began dismantling the wards. To them, it was a routine cleanup. To Margaret, it was the erasure of everything she had fought for. Every bandage tied, every wound washed, every act of fragile mercy that had kept her human. When the commanding officer visited her bedside, he handed her a commendation letter. "You disobeyed a direct evacuation order," he said, tone clipped. "But the report says you prevented an escape and saved Allied personnel. That's more than most could have done." She didn't answer. She only looked toward the window where the Red Cross flag had finally been taken down. By evening, the hospital stood empty again. The silence was unbearable. Anna came to her one last time. "I'm leaving for Kiel," she said. "My mother's there. You should come." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." She spent the night walking through the halls. Every room was a memory. The boy with a crushed leg who had smiled when she changed his bandages. The old sergeant who had died whispering his daughter's name. The corner where Adler had sat, refusing morphine until the others had enough. Ghosts lingered everywhere. In the operating room she found something folded beneath a blood-stained pillow. A note written in clumsy English. It read, "You said mercy makes us human. I did not believe you. But you stayed. For that, I owe you my life. It was signed, F. Adler. Her hands trembled as she read it. Outside, she could hear the rumble of trucks fading into the distance. The city of Lübeck was rebuilding, but the wounds inside her felt deeper than any she had treated. Weeks later, she was reassigned to a new Allied hospital in Hamburg. Yet stories about the nurse who stayed with the enemy spread quietly among soldiers and civilians alike. Some admired her courage, others questioned her loyalty. But those who had seen war understood. Compassion had been rarer than victory. One afternoon, as she supervised the new ward, a messenger handed her a sealed envelope. It bore the insignia of the International Red Cross. Inside was a short report, a list of names from a POW camp near Bremen. Her eyes froze on one line: Adler, Franz, transferred. Location undisclosed. Status: alive. She folded the paper slowly, a faint, tired smile crossing her lips. The next morning, she wrote a single letter addressed to the Red Cross headquarters in Geneva. If he is alive, please ensure he receives medical attention. He was not just a prisoner. He was a man who learned mercy when the world had forgotten it. No reply ever came. But somehow that didn't matter. For Margaret, the letter wasn't about saving one man. It was about saving what little goodness war had not destroyed. As months turned into years, she continued to serve. The faces of those she'd treated blurred together, but the memory of that ruined hospital and the choice she made never faded. She had defied orders, risked her life, and offered care to those branded as monsters. Not because they deserved it, but because humanity did. And in the quiet corners of every hospital she worked in afterward, there was always one empty bed kept clean, a silent reminder of the enemy she had once healed. Years passed. Europe rose from its ashes, cities rebuilt, and nations tried to forget the horrors that had once defined them. But for Margaret Ellison, the war never truly ended. It lived quietly in her mind, in the smell of iodine and smoke, in the sound of rain against hospital glass, in the faces of those she had refused to abandon. After 1945, she continued serving with the Red Cross through post-war recovery missions in France, Poland, and Austria. Wherever she went, she carried with her the lesson Lübeck had taught, that mercy was not weakness, but resistance. When people asked her why she had stayed behind that day, she would simply reply, "Because someone had to remember we were still human." The official records listed her as commendably insubordinate. Her story was briefly mentioned in an Allied medical bulletin, buried among reports of troop recoveries and supply shortages. There were no medals, no photographs, no ceremony. History rarely rewards quiet courage, but those who had known her never forgot. In 1948, a letter arrived at her small London apartment, written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. It was forwarded through the Red Cross. Inside, a single page. I live now in a small village near Munich. I work as a farmer. Every spring when the wheat grows, I remember the day you looked at me and saw not an enemy, but a man. I survived because of that moment. F. Adler. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her medical journal, between the pages describing wound care and field procedures. She never replied. There was nothing left to say. In the years that followed, she volunteered in hospitals treating refugees and displaced civilians, people still scarred by a war that had ended only on paper. Some recognized her name, having heard whispers of the British nurse who saved Germans. She never corrected them, never claimed the title. She only said, "I did what any nurse should do." By the time she retired, the world had moved on. Television shows and history books spoke of generals and victories, of tanks and treaties, but not of the small rooms where mercy had quietly outlived vengeance. On a gray November morning in 1971, she passed away in her sleep at the age of 60. Among her few possessions were her Red Cross badge, a worn Bible, and one framed photograph of the Lübeck hospital. Its windows shattered, the sky pale behind it. Pinned beside it was the note she had found years earlier. "You said mercy makes us human." When her colleagues cleared her belongings, they found no diary, no memoir, only a short inscription on the back of the photograph in her handwriting. Compassion is the last victory of war. Her story was never published in official archives, yet it lived on quietly, retold by the nurses she had trained, by patients who remembered her calm voice, and by a single farmer in Germany who kept a faded photograph of a British nurse on his mantle. History often remembers the ones who fought, but sometimes it is those who healed, those who stayed when everyone else left, who truly changed what it meant to be human in war.